Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
Thanks so much for being here for our second installation of the Many Faces of Forgiveness with our wonderful clergy team here at Temple Israel. So over the course of the class, we're looking at different dimensions of forgiveness. Of course, the High Holy Days and specifically Yom Kippur are seen as this time of forgiveness. We are taught in the Mishnah that Yom Kippur itself as a day atones for all of our sins. But of course, those are just, sin has such a charged element as a word. Sometimes people use transgression. But generally we can talk about times when we've fallen short, when we've missed the mark, when we've hurt other people, when we've been hurt. And so the Mishnah teaches that Yom Kippur is as a day, just by virtue of the power of its day, atones, but it's only atoning for mistakes that have been made between a person and God, but not for, does not atone for things that have happened between us, ben adam l'chaveiro, between human beings and one another. And that's really what we're focusing on in our series. And so last week, I know Rabbi Jeff taught about forgiving others. And I think when we think of forgiveness, that's usually what we think about, forgiving others or perhaps seeking forgiveness for ourselves. But of course, it doesn't end there. And actually, I would say that, we divided it into this tripartite, this three-section structure, but it's all very much interconnected. And part of the task of forgiveness is also forgiving ourselves, not being too hard on ourselves. I know when we're in services and part of kind of the ritual is when we're listing out all of the things that we've done wrong in the past year, we beat our chests. Usually it's like a light tap, but that motion is kind of a tampered down form of what we would call self-flagellation, of beating ourselves up over things that we've done. And certainly guided by modern research into psychology, we understand that on the one hand, there's a lot of power in acknowledging our responsibility for our actions. That's something that we need to do. But at the same time, we don't want to get caught in that cycle of shaming, of punishing ourselves, because at the end of the day, the point of Yom Kippur, the point of taking this opportunity at the beginning of a new year to seek forgiveness and atonement is in hopes that we will change. And in many ways, this whole process in and of itself is a prayer and a statement of hope that we are able to change, that we are not beholden to our cycles and the things we've done in the past. And so that's what we're going to be exploring today, that sense of what it means to forgive ourselves. And I thought we'd start with a little bit of music. I titled this Finding Our Way. And the words of this psalm, specifically this verse, are something that carry us through the month of Elul. It's something traditionally, for at least the past 250 years in many traditional Ashkenazi communities, it is sung twice a day for the entire month of Elul and really everything leading through Sukkot. So that's 50 days, more or less, and reciting these verses 100 times, more or less. But I think it's in so many ways, there's a lot of different reasons why we sing this during Elul, but I think that in so many ways, finding these sacred spaces to do this hard work of forgiveness, of atonement, of cheshbon nefesh, of internal reflection and accounting kind of what this past year has been for us, is made possible by finding a sacred place, a safe space where we're able to do that. And I think for all of us, thinking of this physical space here at Temple, that is that safe and sacred space. But tonight, when we're talking about Beit Adonai, the house of God, or the Heichal Adonai, God's palace, I want us to envision that rather than going into an external place, a physical place, we're actually going into an internal place. We're going into that inner Beit HaMikdash, that sacred house within ourselves, where our true and pure self resides. And sometimes getting back there can be really hard. So for me, music is often a way that allows me to kind of find my way there. So I thought we'd begin and we'll end with a little bit of singing. If you know this melody, feel free to sing along. If not, feel free to just let the music wash over you. Achad shalti meitadon Vakesh Achad shalti meitadon Beit Adonai, Kol Yamei Chaya, Lachazot benoam Adonai, Levaker B'Heichalo. Lachazot benoam Adonai, Levaker B'Heichalo. Alti, one thing I ask of God, only this do I seek, to live in the house of Adonai all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the eternal, to visit God's holy temple. Okay, let's go ahead and dive in. First question, why forgive? Why forgive ourselves? It's a really powerful and deep question. Before I give kind of my answer, I'm curious, or perhaps even if we were to expand it out to forgiveness as a whole, what do people see as the power of forgiveness?
Kind of freeing yourself from like the prison of always thinking about the wrongs that you have done or other people have done to you.
Absolutely, a sense of freedom.
Moving forward.
Moving forward, yeah.
It actually
Definitely.
causes an unburdening.
Unburdening, absolutely, yeah, a lightening of our loads. We all carry enough as it is. I think taking an opportunity to unburden ourselves, whether it's unburdening ourselves from what other people have done to us, or perhaps, and this is what we're going to look at today, the guilt or the shame surrounding what we may have done to others in the past. So that's why I brought, and I'm going to give kind of two lenses of explanations for why forgive. I read part of this comes from, I read an article written by Rabbi Karen Kedar, who was a rabbi in Chicago for a long time and has written really wonderful prayers, poems, all kinds of different things. We'll have a prayer by her. And one of the things one of the verses that she cites from Jewish tradition as being the source of what it means to forgive ourselves is this ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, love your fellow, often translated as love your neighbor as yourself. And most of us think about this as treating everyone with a sense of dignity, with a sense of equality, but of course, it is predicated on this notion of loving ourselves. Meaning it is hard for us to love others if we don't have that love for ourselves. It begins with us.
As the great Rabbi RuPaul said.
As the great Rabbi RuPaul said. Exactly. Exactly. And forgiving ourselves is a part of that self-love. And that's really what I want to predicate this entire session on. People often talk about the Hebrew root for repentance is teshuvah, which comes from lashuv, meaning to return, this idea of returning. And certainly on Yom Kippur, this day that is associated with forgiveness, that has forgiveness at its heart. Actually, this Leviticus 19 is the chapter that we read from in the Torah on Yom Kippur afternoon here at Temple Israel. That it is a return home. You're not supposed to do all of the things that you gradually learn to do over the course of your life. Obviously, eating and drinking, but we're also not supposed to adorn ourselves. We're not supposed to, traditionally wear super ostentatious clothing.
No leather.
Yeah, the whole thing about wearing leather or leather shoes, it's really about returning to a basic sense of ourself, showing that who we are is not what we wear, it's not what's in our pocket, it's not how much money is in our bank account, it's about how we live and how we treat others. Can I get a volunteer to read this passage? We're gonna be really heavy on Brene Brown tonight, so I hope y'all are prepared. But one of the most powerful writers, I think, about this internal sense of forgiveness. Can I get a volunteer to read aloud this passage?
To forgive is not just to be altruistic, it is the best form of self-interest. It is also a process that does not exclude hatred and anger. These emotions are all part of being a human being. You should never hate yourself or hating others who do terrible things. The depths of your love is shown by the extent of your anger. However, when I talk of forgiveness, I mean the belief that you can come out of the other side a better person than the one being consumed by anger and hatred. Remaining in that state blocks you in a state of victimhood, making you almost dependent on the perpetrator. If you can find it in yourself to forgive, then you are no longer chained to the perpetrator. You can move on, and you can even help the perpetrator to become a better person too.
Thank you.
But there's so many, right? Someone murders how do you forgive? Or murders your son or daughter or spouse? Well,
It's a really good
to
question.
me,
It's a really good question. I would save it for next week. I
okay.
know Rabbi Greenstein's gonna be talking about when it's hard to forgive. Which is a difficult thing. And there's been a lot of different efforts with people, particularly in for example, one of the, I don't know what Rabbi Greenstein's gonna teach about, so I don't wanna trample on his course too much. But for example, there have been many examples in history of people who have had wrong done to them, very severe wrong, that have forgiven the perpetrator and really guided by this concept that by forgiving them, it's not about giving them absolution. It's it's for us. It's not for them, it's for us. And I think that when we're thinking about forgiving ourselves, and this is a technique that a lot of therapists use, if we are open to forgiving other people and approaching other people with empathy, we should be able to do that with ourselves as well. And it works the reverse way. If we are more empathetic with ourselves, it makes it easier for us to be forgiving and empathetic of others. But of course, there are always limits. There are always limits. As Dr. Brown says, not the soda person, Dr. Brene Brown. You should never hate yourself for hating others who do terrible things. You caring about those terrible things is an extension of your love for the world, for whatever it may be. So that's kind of framing what we're going to be talking about. When we think about forgiving ourselves, I wanted to get into the mindset and really the emotional landscape of what might be going on inside of our hearts. And so I drew from another of Brene Brown's books. I think it came out 2 years ago, maybe 3. It's called The Atlas of the Heart. It's kind of an encapsulation of a lot of the work that she's done and research. And this comes from the section, I think it's called When We've Fallen Short. And it addresses these internal feelings of shame, guilt, humiliation, and embarrassment. So I don't want to spend too much time on all 4 because we're really going to focus on shame. But the difference that she delineates in there is shame is the feeling of I am bad. The focus is on yourself, not your behavior. It's seeing, in a fancy philosophical term, you would see badness as an ontological state, that we by our very nature are bad, not things that we do are bad. The result is feeling flawed and unworthy of love, belonging, and connection. Shame is not a driver of positive change. Guilt is a little bit different. I do something bad. The focus is on behavior. Guilt is the discomfort we feel when we evaluate what we've done or failed to do against our values. It can drive positive change in behavior. And so I would say that in its most ideal form, saying al chet shechatanu lefanecha, for the sin that we have committed against you, is how it's usually translated, is an acknowledgement not of shame, but of guilt, of understanding that there have been times, and we're going to be talking about this, part of this understanding, and part of what makes it easier for us to forgive ourselves is understanding that we are human. We are not perfect. We can't do the right thing all the time in every given moment. We are flawed. And so doing hurtful things in many ways is kind of part of our nature. Because we are beings that live in relationship. We are a species that perhaps more than, I would say even more than anything else, our strength is in our cooperation. And we'll see that shame is kind of like a social feeling as well, but of course our social feelings become internalized. Real quick, humiliation is being belittled or put down by someone, leaving us feeling unworthy of connection, disgusted with ourselves, kind of internalizing an external accusation or humiliation. It was unfair and didn't deserve it. She distinguishes that with shame, we believe that we deserve our sense of unworthiness. With humiliation, we feel we don't deserve it, meaning that humiliation really comes to this sense of dignity in the self. And I don't want to focus too much on it today because that usually comes from outside. Although feel free to challenge me on that one. And then finally, embarrassment. I did something that made me uncomfortable, but I know I'm not alone. Everyone does these kinds of things. Embarrassment is fleeting, sometimes funny. We all do embarrassing things sometimes, and
Not just sometimes.
Okay, so what we're really going to be looking at is shame and what shame can do to us and what the antidote can be. And that's really where this conversation about self-love, self-forgiveness, self-compassion comes in. So Dr. Brown and this graphic is really great. It's in your packets here, or I guess your collection of sheets, since the stapler didn't work. Is you have this little petri dish and you have this initial shame, and the things that make it grow and create a good ecosystem for it are things like judgment, secrecy, and silence. When we hold on to our shame, it grows more power within us. And it becomes a very isolating experience. And so she writes, shame needs you to believe that you're alone. In contrast, empathy is a hostile environment for shame. Self-compassion is often the first step to healing shame. We need to be kind to ourselves before we can share our stories with someone else. So I don't want to go too deep into really the focus of parts of this chapter, but she draws from the work of this woman named Dr. Kristen Neff, who really is one of the pioneering students, or someone who studies researchers of self-compassion, has actually founded a center for it. So that's really what we're going to focus in on. So the three elements of self-compassion that Dr. Neff identifies are self-kindness, common humanity, and mindfulness. So let's take a look at what those are. Can I get a volunteer to read self-kindness versus self-judgment?
I'd read.
All right.
Self-compassion entails being warm and understanding toward ourselves when we suffer, fail, or feel inadequate, rather than ignoring our pain or flagellating ourselves with self-criticism. Self-compassionate people recognize that being imperfect, failing, and experiencing life difficulties are inevitable. So they tend to be gentle with themselves when confronted with painful experiences, rather than getting angry when life falls short of set ideals.
Great, thank you. Any thoughts on this?
Sorry,
Any thoughts?
I have a lot of thoughts. But, I don't know how well it fits into what is said, all these things. You mentioned that being able to forgive others makes it easier to forgive yourself also.
Hmm,
And I don't experience that at all. I've had people who did the most horrific things to me, and I have forgiven them and even helped them now. Myself, I keep screwing up. And I'm very well aware that I am, and I keep feeling bad about it, and yet I do it over and over again.
Yeah.
And
it's hard.
it's hard, and consequently or subsequently, I don't forgive myself for these things.
Hmm.
And sometimes I'm like, gee, you're an idiot.
What makes it hard to forgive yourself?
I don't know. I feel that it's like someone said to me, well, you know, a lot of people do this. When I said, no, you can't be doing that. And, oh, no, everybody does it. I said, so a lot of people murder. Are you gonna murder? It's.
So it's
and
kind of
says- it
holding
says
your-
it here
I
too.
think,
Holding you to a higher
I think we tend
standard.
to have, yeah, I think we tend to have higher standards for ourselves sometimes than we might for others. We're harder on
But I-
ourselves.
I think age makes a difference. I think you become more compassionate with yourself as you get older. When you're young, you very anything that you do that you think is wrong really upsets you. And when you get older, it doesn't. You realize that you're imperfect and you don't have the same problem to that extent.
Any other ideas?
Where I struggle with it, and this is the same for myself as well as with others, and I was like working through a little bit of this last week in Rabbi Jeff's class, is like, I feel like it's a choice you have to make to treat yourself with compassion, and I don't know how to make that choice. Like there comes a time where, like, there's just been enough time and space between events where like I don't really think about them that much, whether it's me or someone else. But I've never been able to like consciously be like, I should treat myself better. I should treat myself with more compassion, unless I'm in like therapy and my therapist is saying it. So yeah, that's where I guess that's my issue with the concept of forgiveness, though, not with this specific thing.
Yeah, it's very much, when people refer to it as a practice, I think that's like why we use that term for it. Because the idea is that if like you get better with time. Now, look, I'm not sitting here saying like I have mastered self-forgiveness. I'm here to share all of the wisdom that I struggle with this big time as well. But I wanna share with everyone kind of what I look to. And I think something I was thinking about, I didn't bring a text that specifically talks about it, but if we go back to that Psalm 27, Akacha Alti, that idea of venturing deep within our hearts into this sacred space within Jewish tradition, each morning there's a prayer that is traditionally recited, Eloheinu shema shenatata bi tahorahi, which means, my God, the soul that you have planted within me is pure. And if we believe that we are made in the image of God, that we have a spark of divinity resting within us, then we only need to look inside to find kind of a source of forgiveness. When people pass away, one of the morning prayers we said, and I didn't include it here because I wanted to be mindful, this was only an hour, is El Male Rachamim, God full of compassion. And we believe that God represents or contains an endless well of forgiveness and compassion. And so I've been thinking about these ideas, like, actually, we can tap into that infinite well by reconnecting with that sacred spark within us. But it's not always easy, because at the end of the day, we gotta get groceries, we gotta go get gas, we got, someone just cut us off on 340 and is driving like a wild person. There's a lot of things that disrupt that. And, I think, and that's why I think the month of Elul came to be this whole month of kind of reflection and preparing ourselves, because you can't just like sit down and practice radical self-compassion or radical forgiveness. I mean, for some people, even like, I think there are plenty of times when we don't want to forgive, and I think we could be forgiven for not wanting to forgive. But from my understanding, from what I've read, and certainly my work with therapists, is, you gotta practice it. It starts small and then build it. But it's hard. It's hard. And it's, that distinction between shame and guilt, between, on the one hand, we don't wanna, we don't wanna be sociopaths and not care about any of our actions and not kind of be able to evaluate our own lives. But on the other hand, we don't want to, punish ourselves. It's a tricky thing. It's a tricky thing.
But what is punishing yourself? I mean, it's not like I'm cutting myself every day. It's, or ever even.
Oftentimes, self-harm actually doesn't necessarily mean physical
Yeah, there
self-harm, although it can, and that is certainly something a lot of people struggle with. But it can also it can come up in other ways. Keeping yourself down, it can come up in like eating habits, exercise habits. There's a lot of different ways we can kind of sabotage ourselves, it's not a conscious thing. It's not like, oh, I have this great opportunity, things are going well, I'm gonna sabotage it. It's very much working on the subconscious level.
But feeling guilty for a lot of things, it's, I don't know, I think it's normal. At least it is for me. I mean, I know that I've been eating all three things, and I felt ashamed all the time while I was eating it.
So, yeah, and so what therapy, not therapist, no psychology degree here, but I've done, in kind of my own work with therapists and also reading a lot of this stuff. I think going back to what Dr. Brown says about, so if the idea is your intended outcome is, okay, let's say it's eating, and you don't necessarily want to eat all of the brownies that come in the package or whatever.
That's a lost cause.
Whatever it might be, but I think going back to what she says, oh. There's a little bit of a typo there, I apologize for that, but what she says, shame is not a driver of positive change. So the idea is that this is on page 2. The idea that we can shame ourselves into changing, which is, I think, very common in our modern culture, is actually very flawed, because then we get caught in shame cycles. Because by shaming ourselves, by saying you were so bad by doing that, we are actually hurting ourselves. And it is from that pain, from the harm that we are inflicting on ourselves, that leads us to do the behaviors that that we don't want to be doing.
I think it's also a way to have more compassion for others, because you know how much things can hurt.
Mhm.
While you basically emotionally hurt yourself, you know how much it hurts, so you're way more forgiving for other people.
And
That's
also
my experience.
How much you struggle with it,
Yeah.
other people are struggling with it probably
Yeah.
that much or more too.
Absolutely. I think that goes back to what she was talking about the isolation involved. Like shame is best suited to shame helps us feel alone. We are the only ones that struggle. And I think that actually anticipates what I'm gonna get to in a second, but let's take a look at the common humanity. This is a very good segue. We're right on track here. So I'll save that point until after this. Could someone read common humanity versus isolation?
Self-compassion involves recognizing that suffering and personal inadequacy is part of the shared human experience, something that we all go through rather than being something that happens to me alone. Keep going. Our God.
Actually, no, let's stop for a second. So I think this relates to what we were just talking about. Like making that shift from this is something only I experience, I'm the only, it's not like, oh, I'm the only one who has problems in the world. It's more about I am alone in this struggle with a part of myself that is harming me. And I think when we think about our relationship with other people, this is a classic marker of abusive relationships and toxic relationships, which is when people feel cut off from the world around them and feel that they are only within the sphere of whoever the person that is abusing. So when I was reading this, I was thinking about, and then Miriam Alana, if you want to read this, and I brought in a passage that the Hebrew comes from the High Holy Day liturgy. But I pulled this one specifically from the Slichot version, Mishkan Lev, it has just a slightly different English translation. But I think this is a really powerful connection between kind of what modern research is showing and the way that we as Jews kind of go through this process collectively, which is that when we are standing there and we're kind of beating on our chests and we're listing all of these ways that we haven't lived up to our values or haven't been the kind of people that we want to be, we don't say I. We say we. And before we say those we's, this is the passage, sometimes in Hebrew, sometimes in English, that we read.
Our God and God of all generations, may our prayers reach your presence. And when we turn to you, do not be indifferent. Adonai, we are arrogant and stubborn, claiming to be blameless and free of sin. In truth, we have stumbled and strayed. We have done wrong. Together we confess. Together we take responsibility.
Thank you. Yeah, I don't know, I would have to be in touch with my professors from rabbinical school to know a little bit more about this, but I don't know who claims to be blameless, or free of sin. I mean, maybe there are people that go in there like, I don't have anything to be repenting for.
My mother, every Yom Kippur, she'd say, and we're going for you guys, not for me.
Well, did she say it like tongue in cheek or she was serious?
No, she was serious,
I go to service.
to get us there.
Yeah, I guess, yeah.
Realistically, it would probably be easier. If you felt like you didn't have any work to do, you know what I'm saying? Like, I envy people that might think like that, but I also can imagine that might be challenging to deal with people who can never, who might never kind of point the finger back to themselves and understand their own frailty, but
It's just very.
did not know your mother, so I don't want to make any assumptions or condemnations for sure. But I think that, whether we think about it or not, the way that we do this as a collective is a really powerful thing, because it's, on the one hand, we are alone, or we are experiencing things that are internal to ourselves, but in Jewish tradition, we believe that that can only be made possible when we are all alone together. Like, we are all going through this process, and it looks different for each one of us, but we are together and going through it. And I think there's a lot of power in that. And I think it speaks to specifically what Dr. Neff, I should say, it still comes from Brene Brown's book, but this idea of common humanity, that we are all guilty of these things, and in many ways, even though we did not inflict the harm ourselves, there is a shared sense of responsibility. And that's why we say that first person hatan, we have sinned. Any other thoughts?
Yeah, so like thinking about the, we are arrogant and stubborn, claiming to be limitless. So like, maybe there is something there where by like, individually overstating the case, you're allowing a community where like, even somebody that was claiming to be blameless and free of sin, even if you personally were like, not at that point, but you're still allowing them to be a part of the community so that they can say that last bit together with you without saying like, most of us have some blame and we acknowledge some other things and whatever. It's like, no, you can like build a big circle that includes a lot of people. And then as long as they're willing to be there with you and like say those last lines, then there's no exclusion.
That's an excellent point. And kind of the converse of that is people that have done really bad things. And there's a lot of literature written about what it means to welcome in quote unquote sinners. Again, that word has a whole lot of charges to it in modern times, but the idea of welcoming in people as part of the community that have transgressed in sometimes much more serious ways than we ourselves. And I think it works both ways by all of us. By all of us taking collective responsibility, it's not pointing to these specific people and like, you're the problem, blah, 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 blah. But that we all kind of share in that. So absolutely, I think that's one of the really beautiful.
If you have done something to someone and you go up to them and say, please forgive me, and they say no, are you then, okay, I'm off the hook, I don't have to ask? Seriously, is it 3 times? I don't know, maybe they just say no.
There are rules around it in terms of, I know like Maimonides has a whole section of the Mishnah Torah that talks about what it looks like to seek out and receive forgiveness, and it needs to be kind of in a public place, and depending on what the grievance was. But theoretically, on the part of the person seeking forgiveness, you've kind of done everything that you can. Now, whether or not there is an obligation upon those of us that have been hurt to forgive those who have hurt us, that'll be for Rabbi Greenstein to address, because that's something, I haven't always fully understood, like, what obligation do we have to forgive? Because it can be such a challenging thing. So I was speaking earlier about the famous examples of people who have been wronged that have forgiven. The family of Martin Luther King is probably one of the best known examples. And then I pulled this from another class that I did at my previous congregation, and there was have folks here seen the documentary Forgiving Dr. Mengele? Highly recommend it. I have no idea if it's like available out there. I remember we watched it in religious school when I was growing up, maybe for confirmation.
That seems very
Intense.
Yeah.
Intense. It was pretty intense. I think I was in high school. But are folks familiar with Dr. Joseph Mengele? For those who aren't, he was a Nazi scientist at Auschwitz who performed a lot of experimentation, very inhumane experimentation. He was particularly fascinated with twins. And there's this woman, Ava Kor, who survived his experiments after a lot of people didn't. And she went through this whole journey of forgiving him for what he did, of course, posthumously. I don't know when he died, but it was before all of this, and went to Auschwitz, read a statement of forgiveness. And so one of the quotes that I had pulled was from her. And it's really powerful to see that, but it's also, I think, in many ways inconceivable. And I think, you know, when we were looking at this, together we confess, together we take responsibility. I think it's important to remember, and I think this balance, which, you know, this is me just projecting, that balance between self-forgiveness and like a productive self-judgment, meaning the ability to evaluate ourselves and use that as spurring change, but not doing it in a way that's self-flagellating, is very, very difficult. And really the two main high holy days represent this dynamic. Rosh Hashanah is known by many different names. Are people familiar with the different names for Rosh Hashanah? So it is Rosh Hashanah, the beginning of the year, literally the head of the year, new year. It's also referred to as Yom HaZikaron in rabbinic literature, the day of remembrance. Now, this is before the state of Israel and the modern Yom HaZikaron. It is
Creation of the world or universe.
Yeah, Yom Harat Olam, the day of the creation of the world, literally the day of the impregnating of the world, because Harat Herayon in Hebrew means pregnancy. That's neither here nor that's for another.
For Kabbalist.
Yeah, for sure. Yom Harat Olam. It is referred to as Yom Teruah, the day of the sounding of shofar, the day of blasts. And finally, it is referred to as Yom Hadin, the day of judgment. And in rabbinic literature, we are taught that on Rosh Hashanah, all of creation passes before God, like a flock of sheep, and God sits there judging everyone for what they did over the past year. And that's why we have a lot of these images in the Rosh Hashanah liturgy about, you know, Avinu Malkeinu, like literally our father, our king. Hamelech Yoshev al Kisei Ram Benisa, God envisioned as a king sitting on a high and lofty throne. There is this deep sense of judgment on Rosh Hashanah. Yom Kippur, on the other hand, is a day of rachamim. It's a day of compassion and forgiveness, that no matter where you are, where you come from, you can find forgiveness. It's slicha, this notion of forgiveness. We sing, you know, Adonai, Adonai, Rachum B'chanun, God, merciful and compassion. And those two poles of judgment, you know, and compassion and forgiveness are really these guiding poles for a lot of the way that Jews understand what it means to be beholden to something larger than ourselves. So in the Talmud, yeah, Ricky, go ahead.
I was something unrelated. I had a friend whose father died about 2 years ago. He survived Auschwitz. He was there about a year. Two things. What he would do, and I'm surprised he survived, when Mengele would walk by, he would just stare at him. He said Mengele would never glance away. That's weird, you know. But anyway, I never asked him, did you ask for forgiveness from the Nazis? I never.
Yeah. It's yeah, and I think it's really in the past 20, 25 years, I feel like when we've seen a lot more of that, you know, with more distance. And I think there have been more opportunities, but I wonder what he would have said.
I wonder if, I'm trying to think for myself, how would I feel? And I'm thinking forgiving Mengele, I don't know if I could, because it just doesn't cross my mind. But if I did, then I think the back thought I would have after that is, okay, so I can forgive him, But there's all these other millions of people who may not, and in the end, God will not. So that would be kind of like a solace to me that if I were to forgive him, then I could let it go and not have this toxicity within me of hatred, knowing that he will take care of it.
Yeah, and that's actually, there's an Elie Wiesel quote, basically along those same lines.
Okay, sorry.
That, I can actually pull it off real quick, if you don't mind me.
It was one of the people we did forgive.
I'm not
He
sure.
Nelson Mandela weren't those two people, I know that there.
I know that
many-
Nelson Mandela definitely did, from what I remember. So the quote that I have, so when Elie Wiesel, he was asked if he forgave the Nazis, the quote that I have is, "I cannot and don't want to forgive the killers of children. I ask God not to forgive." Not to forgive.
Okay, I'm asking a
Um,
question. Does that mean that, on Yom Kippur, when God has compassion, correct me if I'm saying anything wrong, okay? Rosh Hashanah starts, you say, hey, you made a mistake, let me think about it for the next few days. And then he has the compassion, he seals the books, and is he, are you saying that he seals the books on Jews and he doesn't seal the books for non-Jews? I'm playing devil's advocate because I'm.
It's a good
confused.
question. It's a good question. You know, are non-Jews beholden to the same calendar of forgiveness
Okay.
as we are?
What,
Is it the
no
same?
high laws?
That is a good question that I am sure Jewish philosophers throughout time have talked about. I don't know the answer to.
But the Noahide laws.
Sure. No,
Yes.
that's not to say, now, I think it's pretty consistent that God is judging all of God's creatures,
Right.
Jew, non-Jew, whatever it is. But whether or not they're held to the same standards might be kind of the question, or in the case of Miriam Alana's question, if it happens in that same sort of 10-day period. Where we're talking, on Rosh Hashanah, it is written, on Yom Kippur, it is sealed.
Okay.
There's the compassion.
Right, and I think that even that metaphor of opening the book, writing the book, sealing the book, also creates questions when we're thinking about the notion of forgiving ourselves and being compassionate and loving to ourselves. I struggle with that notion that within these 10 days, the entire year is laid out, and then that's it. There's nothing we can do, the time's passed. Because I'm of a mindset that there's always opportunities for that. Of course, it's funny from like a larger historical, cultural framework that even though we say on Rosh Hashanah, it's written in Yom Kippur, it is sealed, there's a bunch of holidays after that become little minor like Yom Kippurs. So like Hoshana Rabbah becomes like another Yom Kippur. So at some point, people in our likely medieval history were like, one day to repent, not enough. Even to the point of, traditionally in morning services, you have kind of a little mini confessional Yom Kippur moment called Akman. But yeah, Lynn.
I don't know if anyone here is old enough to remember when in the public schools, we started each morning with the Lord's Prayer. There's a line in there, forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. So that's there answers back to mainly, if I couldn't forgive that, why should my sins be forgiven?
We did not have that in the New York City public schools. I would say that 90% of our teachers were Jewish.
I grew up with that as well, Lynn.
I didn't grow up with Lord's Prayer. I grew up with 10 verses every day from the Bible, and it passed down the road. And when it got to my turn, I always read from Song of Songs, which greatly frustrated my teachers, but
I'm sure. I'm sure. Yeah, it's one of those great questions that not all traditions, or at least traditions that purport enough, I guess there could be a religious tradition of anarchism or do whatever you want.
Unitarians.
I'm not saying anything disparaging our many wonderful neighbors. But, the question of like, how harsh is judgment? What does it look like? Does it happen now, here and now? Does it happen in the hereafter? But just going back to kind of the Jewish perspective, this notion of din and rachamim, of judgment and compassion. In the Talmud, there's many crazy things that happen in the Talmud. One of which being, someone asks, what does God say when God prays?
Oh, I love that.
What does God say when God prays?
Does God pray?
Why does he have to?
Who does he pray to?
Yeah.
Well,
His own mind.
that is a great question. All of these
Is there
questions.
like a grand God?
No. No, but the prayer that is written down and passed down in the Talmud that God says to God's self is, may my aspect of mercy overcome my aspect of judgment. Which is God praying that in the end, compassion wins out. Love wins out, forgiveness wins out within God's self. Because of course, in Jewish tradition, you have one God that on the one hand is the source of judgment, is Elkanah, a wrathful, a vengeful, a jealous God. But you also have a very forgiving, compassionate God. Within the same book, we have, I will visit the sins of the parents upon the children's and the children's children, extending throughout the generations. But then you also have that same God saying, no, I'll forgive. Children should not be punished for the sins of their parents. So we have both of these things. And I think that we within ourselves contain both of those things.
And no man can die for another man's sins,
Right,
so.
right. And so the idea is that, and this is very much a Kabbalistic perspective, that like in a similar dynamic, we have these things within ourselves. We have those parts of ourselves that judge and shame and guilt and punish. And we have those parts of ourselves that forgive, that offer empathy and compassion. And this is very much kind of continuing with the Kabbalistic idea and sort of the notion of a practice is that these different midot, these different characteristics within ourselves can be nourished and trained, and that's where we get the notion of a lot of the ideas of the Musar movement. Maybe next year for Elul we can do a little Musar class, because it's very much so. All right, we got 5 minutes. Yes, Rick.
Real quickly, when I die, I want to see God. I don't want justice. I want compassion and mercy. Justice to me is harsh.
Yeah,
If he's going to be compassionate and merciful, well, we can talk about it.
We separate you on.
Yeah, right. Exactly.
well, eternal damnation, not quite our thing as
Yeah,
Jews, so maybe that will help you rest easy at night.
When we took the Intro to Judaism class with Rabbi Feigl, he told us that there is a Jewish hell, but it only lasts for 11 months and you get Saturdays off.
You get Saturdays
You get
off.
Shabbats off, yes.
Yes, that's a whole other, yeah, it's like a cleansing factory.
This is
Kind
where
of
the
the way-
Roman Catholics got their purgatory from.
Yes, yeah, so, but again, not about the afterlife, or at least this class isn't. And we didn't get to the third part of self-compassion, as Dr. Neff lays it out, so real quickly, mindfulness versus over-identification. Mindfulness is a non-judgmental, receptive mind state in which one observes thoughts and feelings as they are without trying to suppress or deny them. We cannot ignore our pain and feel compassion for it at the same time. At the same time, mindfulness requires typo there, that we not be over identified with thoughts and feelings so that we are caught up and swept away by negative reactivity. And I think that's the distinction between guilt and shame, meaning guilt is saying, I'm not happy with these actions that I did. Shame is, I'm not happy with who I am. And I think that's an over identification with what, meaning these are the things that I do, which makes me who I am. And I think certainly for us as Jews, there is a distinction between what we do and who we are. We are, by nature, we are born into this world pure and good. And then the actions we take, either require repentance or do not. We are not in our essence sinners or bad people or whatever it is. We're human. We're imperfect. Only God is perfect. And I thought this was really interesting, kind of this mindfulness versus over identification in the way that we list out whether it's Ashamnu, Bagadnu, Gazalnu, so on and so forth, or Al Chet Shechatanu, these litanies of transgressions that we go through over the course of the High Holy Days. I think when I read about this, when it says you observe your thoughts and feelings as they are without trying to suppress or deny them, I see us listing out these parts as a very similar kind of practice. It's and I think being able to acknowledge these things that have happened without saying these things have happened and therefore I am a bad person and not worthy of love or affection or whatever it might be, is kind of like putting that into practice. And of course, mindfulness practices are really powerful when it comes to nurturing that sense of self-compassion and growing that muscle, as it were. Of course, it's all great in theory. It's very hard to do. I struggle with it in my own life. So
You still have a whole life in front of you.
I have a whole life of struggle in front of me.
You're a lot younger than most of us.
So we're almost at 8. I wanted to bring in one piece of music and a final prayer for us. But before that, any kind of closing thoughts or ideas? And those of you joining us online, I haven't seen any hands, but if I missed any, feel free to share some reflections with us.
I guess I'm just still struggling with the whole concept of forgiveness, and I'm wondering, I guess maybe poll the room if y'all feel comfortable, is letting go of guilt and shame and humiliation and embarrassment, is that equal to forgiving ourselves, or is that just because I feel like that should be our default state of not shaming ourselves, not feeling super guilty, but is that what forgiveness is, or is it something different?
I'd say for me, despite all that, I forgive myself. Like saying, yeah, I've got all that, but I'm still okay. And I'm saying what I would like to do. This is not me in
Of
practice.
course, yeah.
But I think in theory, this is, I've got all this junk. But even though I've got all this junk, God forgives me. I'm not better than God, so I must be able to forgive myself. In theory.
I always feel that I should forgive myself, but not forget what I've done. Because if I forget what I've done, then I'm not going to improve.
I think we also we can't confuse forgiving ourselves with justifying something we have done,
Right.
And the other thing, as someone brought this up earlier, that after Rosh Hashanah, when we're trying to make amends with other people, and we go to them and we say, please forgive me, almost always, and that's if you've ever had that happen, it's a terribly profound experience, and that person is almost always universally willing to forgive and move on. But when you're trying to forgive yourself, who do you say that to? You say that to your harshest critic. I need to forgive. You ask yourself to forgive yourself. And that is probably the hardest person you could talk to about forgiveness. And so this is not an easy topic and one that we need to brush off. I think with the people in this room, if I went to any one of you and said, I have wronged you, would you please forgive me? And I know all of you and I love you and you love me, that would be an easy fix. Forgiving myself is much tougher, much tougher.
It is. That's hard.
I think some of these things are also necessary, the little bit of shame, the little bit of that, but just to keep us in check. How do you say that? In check? Just to make sure that you don't go over your limits. I mean, many of us, including me, we do anyhow, because we are repeat offenders. But at least it keeps us from going off the reservation.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's hard and it's, I had a thought of it, it just flew away from me. That's okay.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think it's a balance and you know, I'm right now I'm teaching 7th and 8th graders. It's a super fun age to be teaching.
Oh, good luck.
Yeah.
And, you know, it's the balance of how strict are we gonna be and how flexible can we be at times? And I think, as Terry was saying, is we all recognize we're often strictest with ourselves. And it's a funny experience, I think, oftentimes when you go to find someone to ask their forgiveness, and this could happen kind of in the next month or so, or it can happen at any point, and say, oh, I feel so bad for whatever happened, you know, I'm really sorry, and they haven't even really thought about it. It's just you that's been thinking. And I think that makes it all the more difficult when it's ourselves, because it's, you know, we're both the one who can't let it go and the one who it actually affected. It's a very strange wraparound, but and I think this is what I was gonna say, it's connected to so many different things. How we are with ourselves, is directly related to how we are with other people. One of the things that Dr. Brene Brown talks about in her book is how when you look at abusers or people that are convicted violent criminals, so much of that is motivated by shame, by a hatred of themselves that then is projected onto other people. And so, it's, you know, looking back on it, having just one hour session about forgiving ourselves is probably not enough. Cause it's an ongoing thing, but hopefully this gave everyone some resources to take a look at and finding a way of framing it within kind of like the Jewish way of thinking about things. Which is very important, specifically Teshuva is like a very important thing. But it's also one of the hardest things that we can do. So with your permission, I'll play a little bit more guitar. And I really love the Hebrew, I think will be familiar to many of us. But I really love the English that Michelle Citrin wrote for this, and specifically at the end.
Is it in here?
It should be on it, yeah.
Finding our words.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Yehiyu ratzoni refi ve'yon nevi. Yehiyu ratzoni refi ve'yon libi lefanecha. Yehiyu ratzoni refi ve'yon nevi. Yehiyu ratzoni refi ve'yon libi lefanecha. Adonai Tsuri. Adonai Tsuri v'goali. Adonai Tsuri. Adonai Tsuri v'goali. Go inside your heart, just be. Go inside your heart and see what it wants, what it needs, what it yearns when you breathe. Go inside your heart and see. May the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart be kind, be true. May they be acceptable to you, oh my Rabbi. Kind of my prayer for all of us as we enter into this High Holy Day season, that the words of our mouths and the meditations of our hearts be kind, be true, and that they will be heard. And then finally, I thought we could read, right version. There. Hoping we could read this prayer written by Rabbi Karen Kadar all together. Let's give it a second to load up. There we go. You'll join with me. God, thank you for
helping me see that each phase of my life is perfect.
I've always been where I need
Always
perfect moments. With your help, relinquish my need to judge. Help me
to grow in acceptance and curiosity.
Thank you for lighting my way, for gently illuminating a path in the dark. Let it now and always be yet another
exquisite phase of the crimes against myself. I'm sorry for all my slips and sides. I forgive myself.
Wishing everyone a meaningful last 2 weeks of Elul and a Shana Tova Metuka sweet and good new year.
Thank
Thank you. Thanks to everyone joining us online. Those of you in person, if you could sign in, we'd love to keep track. Everyone that was here, but thank you all so much for being here. Thanks for everyone joining online, and be sure to return next week with Rabbi Greenstein. I'm sure it's going to be an amazing class. I might.
Rabbi, I don't know if anyone else had this problem, but I had a little problem finding the link to this today. I had to go way back to last week sometime to get a link.
Yes, so the link is sent out when you register online. So either hang on to the link or you can re-register yourself and it'll send it along.
I did, and it didn't send anything you could click on.
Okay, got it.
Yeah.
All right. Let me go grab one.
Yasher Koach, thank you. Good night, everybody.
Good session. Yasher Koach.
Thank you, everybody. Good night.
Bye,
Bye, Russell.